The 2026 two sessions, the annual meetings of the National People's Congress and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, set the tone for China's policy agenda for the year and help launch the new 2026-2030 development cycle under the 15th five-year plan. CGTN's Zhu Zhu has more in this report.
Chinese Premier Liang delivered the government work report at the opening meeting of the fourth session of the 14th National People's Congress, outlining the main development targets for this year. The expected economic growth target is 4.5% to 5%, with efforts aimed at achieving even better results in practices. The report also highlighted other key targets for the year. The target for urban unemployment is around 5.5%, with a goal of creating over 12 million new jobs in cities. The consumer price increase is expected to be around 2%, and residents' income growth will aim to match overall economic growth. The government is also focused on maintaining a balanced international payment situation, while also striving to reduce carbon emissions per unit of GDP by about 3.8%. Premier Li emphasized that these targets were set to allow space for structural adjustments, risk prevention, and reform in the early stages of the year, laying a solid foundation for future growth. These economic targets are aligned with the long-term vision for 2035 and are consistent with China's potential for long-term growth. During the 14th five-year plan, China's economy has grown at an average annual rate of over 5%, with notable improvements in productivity and consumer spending. And this year marks the beginning of China's 15th five-year plan. China is continuing to modernize its governance system and improve its market economy. The country is also expanding its openness, strengthening its international cooperation mechanisms. Additionally, there has been a focus on making people's democracy more institutionalized, while also reinforcing the rule of law. All this highlights China's ability to plan ahead and to ensure steady growth.
That was CGTN's Zhu Zhu reporting. Later, we'll focus on two other priorities at this year's two sessions: technology and innovation, and green development and climate. But first, the economy. Joining us is Liang. She's a chair professor at Willamette University. Liang, great to see you. Now, China has set a 2026 GDP growth target of between 4.5% and 5%, and also aims to create something like 12 million jobs. Looking at those numbers, the upper number 5% and the lower limit 4.5%, how does that factor into Beijing's goal to double GDP in about 10 years?
Yeah, good to be with you, Anand. So I think this range, has already sparked a lot of debates. I think the Western media have been talking about this rate, or the 4.5%. It's a very low target, as low as since the 1991 or the early 1990s. But I think the way to look at this is really, Beijing is aiming for the long-term goal, as you mentioned, to double the GDP from 2020 to 2035, which would require a cumulative annual growth rate about 4.7%. Now, given the past 5 years of a strong growth, from this point on, from 2026 to 2035, China needs to about 4.3% at the minimum annually, cumulatively, right, to reach that goal. So I think that 4.5, even at that lower bound, if China is able to achieve that, that will still help China to be on track to that long-term goal. And then to have this kind of range of target, it affords more flexibility for Beijing to think about other important social economic objectives like structural reforms, and also for the building national unified market, because it reduces pressure on the local governments to try to strive for higher GDP growth. So they have more room for sustainability goals, for social stability goals, and for other, I would say, social objectives.
Now, this year's two sessions also marks the formal adoption of the 15th five-year plan. What do you see as the most significant economic priorities in this plan?
Well, I think the most important, the top priority for the country is to construct and build this sort of the new economy and the real economy. And so what that means is that, there will be a lot of efforts to nurture new and emerging industries to pivot away from the previous, real estate property market expansion kind of driven growth in the past few years. And there's also a lot of efforts, be put to the technological self-reliance. Again, this is the idea that it is an economic priority because technology is going to be able to drive economic growth with these new industries like 6G, humanoids, robotics, AI, and others. But also, it is a national security concern, right? That there will be chokeholds. For example, the semiconductor industry, the lithographic sort of machinery, where China still does not have the full capacity and full capability to produce it. So I think that technological self-reliance is important economic and I would say security imperative. Then there's also other measures or other priorities such as sustainable growth, right? Green transition, investing in the people, and so on and so forth. But I think the key here is again the emphasis on the real economy. So not the financial or not the real estate sort of did not dominate kind of economy and try to push for the so-called high quality development, which means productivity driven, inclusive, but also sustainable.
And I'm wondering how much of this is going to be something of a balancing act, because you mentioned some of those factors there that are in the 5-year plan, things like economic growth, social stability, environmental sustainability as well. What do you see in the 5-year plan that will help China move ahead on all three fronts?
Yeah, absolutely. Now that you mentioned the rebalancing, I think another top priority of the 15th five-year plan is to nurture a stronger domestic demand or domestic market. And so that includes both promoting consumption demand, but also unleash or promote this effective investment. So I think that is another very important priority, right, in terms of the balancing, in terms of economic growth, social stability, but also environmental sustainability. So the reason I think here, again, it's important is that when you have high growth that is driven by investment, the argument is that you would need to have consumption, right, to validate the kind of large expansion on your supply. So we know that China in the past few years has been, in a way, challenged with the disinflation, right? So there is relatively low domestic demand in terms of consumption compared to its very fast pace of supply side expansion. So I think that is one, imperative for the government to promote more consumption growth. But again, I think domestic demand includes not just consumption, but investment is also really important because investment is still the ultimate driver, right, of economic growth. Consumption relies on income growth, right? You need to have jobs, you need to have income for consumers to be able to spend. So that's why I think investment is still important to create jobs, to create income growth. So again, the emphasis here is effective investment. So the investment needs to be, effective to deliver the real tangible benefits to the economy. And then social stability, right? That means you need to have job growth, that need to have income growth. And so I think all of the three objectives are reinforcing each other. And I think that is really important, right, for China to, in a way, rebalance the economy. And I would also argue, promoting domestic demand now for Beijing, it's not just an economic imperative. It is also a strategic imperative, given that the Western economies now are increasingly weaponizing this kind of global integration and weaponizing their market assets. So that's why I think this is really a top priority for Beijing.
So what you're telling us here is that there's quite a transformation taking place. I mean, you mentioned investment, that's going to be very important as well. But this transformation from property-driven expansion to things like innovation, green industry, as well as domestic consumption, I mean, how important is that? How significant and profound is it?
Oh, it's very profound. It is going to shape the Chinese economy, in the years to come or decades to come. So first of all, I think the property-driven growth, the model itself wasn't, wrong, but it has been outdated, right? I mean, China now has the highest home ownership in the world, around 90%. So I think, the kind of property expansion was needed in some phase of China's development. But given the population, the demographic changes, and given that China has already built so much, right? So the next step is to pivot away from that and try to search for the new growth engine. And I think the kinds of technological driven or innovation driven and sort of growth is what China is needed, right, for the next phase of growth. So when it comes to nurturing these emerging and future industries, these industries would create a lot of spillover effects. When you think about AI, it's not just a large language model, but it's a whole ecosystem, right? Semiconductor chips production, AI models, then you have the influences, and also cloud platforms and data analysis. It's a whole ecosystem that is being built up. And also, when these technologies are integrated into the traditional industries like construction, mining, manufacturing, services, they help to promote productivity growth. So that's why it is very important for China to have the kind of productivity-driven growth that is going to be more sustainable, and also would really help to promote productivity growth and therefore income growth. And the challenge here, of course, is it's not just a profound change for China, but it's also a profound change for the rest of the world. So, for example, China now is the largest exporter of automobiles. Last year, China exported about 8.34 million units of vehicles, including over 3 million of the NEVs. So that challenged some of the traditional, exporters like Japan, US, or EU. So I think the rest of the world is talking about the second shock, right? Second China shock. So I would say, yes, it is a profound change for both China, but also for the rest of the world as well.
Liang, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Green development is a defining pillar of China's 15th five-year plan, positioning ecological progress as a driver of economic growth and innovation. With world-leading investments in renewable energy, electrification and low-carbon technologies, China is advancing energy security at home while supporting global climate goals. Yixing served as a research director for Breakthrough Energy, and he joins us now. Yixing, thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, China's five-year plan emphasizes a transition toward greener, more sustainable development with major reductions in greenhouse gases. What does that suggest about the balance between energy security and reducing greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, I think for China, energy security is a prerequisite for the green transition. And carbon-heavy assets like coal power plants will not be retired prematurely until renewable energy infrastructures and energy storage capacity are robust enough to handle the baseload. So for China, the decarbonization is basically energy security too. So by aggressively expanding wind and solar, China reduces its reliance on imported oil and gas. And every gigawatt of solar generated domestically is a gigawatt that does not need to be imported from the volatile global market. So instead of immediately phasing out coal, so now coal is being repositioned as supporting energy source. So coal power plants are being upgraded to provide the so-called peak shaving services, essentially sitting idle most of the time until wind and solar output drops, at which point coal power plants can ramp up to keep the grid stable. So this allows China to keep building wind and solar and other renewables at the record speed without risking blackouts caused by too much intermittence of wind and solar. So by focusing on carbon intensity rather than just the absolute cap on emission, the China's plan provides a buffer for economic growth. So this ensures that the decarbonization process does not throttle industry output or cause any social instability, maintaining the economic stability portion of the framework.
So you say that China is rolling out these technologies at record speed. Are you confident then that it will meet its targets, its goals?
Absolutely. I think China has proven for many years that not only it can meet its goals, it can actually meet these goals probably several years earlier than people's expectations. So I'm pretty confident China can meet its carbon goals and renewable goals.
Now, this plan focuses on boosting green high-tech manufacturing, things that we see right now, things like electric vehicles, solar energy, wind energy as well, as a driver of economic growth. How important is green technology innovation?
Yeah, in China's strategy, the green technology innovation is the primary engine for the country's next stage industrialization. So a few data to share. So by early this year, China has essentially turned its green energy sector into the 8th largest economy in the world on its own, and contributing about 11% of the national GDP, and driving more than 1/3 of its total growth in 2025. So it's a huge sector, and it's very important. And innovation is also very important for China's carbon goals. So China has already deployed a large amount of wind and solar and EV already. And in the future, more innovation will be around technologies such as smart grids, energy storage, especially long-duration energy storage, and hydrogen. These technologies are going to help manage the large scale of highly variable renewables.
Now, China is the undisputed world leader in renewables, and it dominates the supply chains for wind, for solar, as well as for battery technology as well. Talk to us about that, and especially the impact that China will have in exporting these technologies and the equipment, of course, to the rest of the world, especially developing countries.
Absolutely. So China's rapid expansion has already acted as a global accelerator by absorbing the first mover cost and risk of scaling this green technology. China has already effectively subsidized the global energy transition. So for the developing countries or the global south, so this isn't just an environmental shift. It is the opportunity for energy independence, and that was previously could be affordable. So China's massive manufacturing capability has already turned renewable energy from a luxury for wealthy countries into the cheapest power source on Earth. For example, both solar and battery prices have already plummeted by more than 80 or 90% in the past decades because of China's capability of large-scale manufacturing, and that drives down the cost. So this has already effectively democratized decarbonization. And for many developing countries in the global south, so China's exports of these technologies are enabling a technology leapfrog, very similar to how these regions keep the landline phone for mobile phone. So this is a great jump. And China is not just exporting the final product. Now China's strategy also includes exporting the supply chain itself. So all these cells, solar cells and panels, and assembly lines, etc., the supply chains are currently being exported to a lot of developing countries. And these supply chains are going to help those developing countries to manufacturing themselves domestically, and that is also very important for their own economy and their own energy transition.
And Yixing, how does the 5-year plan, the 15th 5-year plan, which has just been adopted, how does that strengthen climate adaptation measures, especially for extreme weather events, things like floods, droughts and heat waves as well?
Yeah, so China now is gradually shifting its climate strategy from just cutting carbon emissions to surviving the climate change. So China is no longer just building solar panels. China is also building the entire infrastructure to be climate proof. For example, China now is writing a new environmental code. So it legally forces every level of government to have its own adoption plan. And that is very critical from the legal perspective. At the same time, China is also building its city infrastructure so that the cities can handle the heavy rain and drought much better than before. And China is using high technology, including the so-called kind of a digital defense, meaning that using 5G sensors to provide warning alerts for floods and or tornadoes or hurricanes, etc., under 15 minutes. So they are using AI to predict heat-related, for example, hospital surgeries before they even happen. So China is using these high-tech digitalization technologies to help people to adapt to the climate change.
Yixing Xu, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Premier Liang told the 14th National People's Congress that developing emerging and future industries will drive China's growth. The new five-year plan emphasizes innovation and technological self-reliance, including increased spending on research and development. Joining us now is Andy Mock. He is a senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Andy, great to see you. Good to have you with us. Now, last year, China's economy grew at a rate of 5%. Reaching more than $20 trillion, and China has set a 2026 GDP growth target of around 4.525%, and that aims to create something like 12 million new jobs. How central is technology to China's development model to create sustainable prosperity?
Anon, technology is absolutely crucial for China to achieve not only its short-term economic goals, but its long-term objectives, the 2035 and the 2049 objectives. And here's why. China's development strategy rests on a simple bet. If the country can combine frontier technology with large-scale industrial deployment and coordinated national investment, then these productivity gains from automation, AI, advanced manufacturing can offset the structural headwinds such as aging demographics and external technology restrictions. And that system where governance turns invention into large-scale deployment is what I call the innovation machine. And it's the central argument of my book, The Innovation Machine, how China creates and adopts technology through governance. And I think this really is a story of how technology drives development, economic development, social development, and I would say political development as well.
Now, Andy, the 2026 government work report, it highlights the development of what it calls new quality productive forces. Define that for us. What does that mean?
Sure, Anand. This is a term that certainly is bandied around quite a lot. And I think we have to understand it in the context of China's goal is high quality growth. And these new productive quality forces through self-reliance in scientific and technological innovation really is the engine that drives that. So we can think about all of these technologies, artificial intelligence, robotics, advanced manufacturing, even quantum computing, fusion energy, et cetera, are all kind of under this rubric of new quality productive forces that can replace the old drivers of the Chinese economy, so real estate, infrastructure, et cetera. And I think this is a recognition that China is willing to trade higher growth for higher quality growth. And of course, there's an inherent trade-off there, but I think that is maybe the best way to understand what new quality productive forces actually means.
Right, you mentioned some of those technologies there, technologies where China has announced breakthroughs. I mean, you mentioned robotics, quantum computing, there's also semiconductors, advanced manufacturing as well. I mean, which of those areas do you think, or in which of those areas would we see the most significant progress?
Well, Anand, I think the short answer is all of the above, but we have to really segment this by time. I think in the next couple of years, certainly robotics, especially deployed in industrial settings, will certainly see some exciting advances. I think one, because China's manufacturing scale, its ability to produce hardware and components like actuators, batteries, et cetera, for robots really gives it an edge. I think the medium term, we can certainly expect breakthroughs in semiconductors. I think that's looking at a little bit of a longer time frame. And then finally, these seemingly science fiction sounding technologies like fusion, like brain-computer interfaces are a little bit further out. But I think one thing it's very important to make clear is that when China makes these kinds of announcements, it's actually based on rigorous, comprehensive planning. So it's not announce and hope. It's actually do the work first and then make the announcement. So I think, when we see, again, this range of technologies, including some very futuristic sounding ones in the plan, I think it really indicates, I think, the scope of China's plans regarding technology and its ability to drive its short-term and long-term development objectives.
Right, and of course there'll be a big emphasis and a big focus on artificial intelligence, AI. China has announced the AI Plus initiative, which plans to integrate these technologies, AI technologies, across various sectors, manufacturing for one, education for another, healthcare as well. I mean, how transformative will this be for China's productivity?
Well, I think, Anand, it will be incredibly transformative, because I think the approach that China is taking to artificial intelligence is different from that taken by the United States, in that the U.S. Private companies are pursuing these frontier models and are aiming for breakthroughs that achieve artificial general intelligence. Whereas I think China is taking what we could call perhaps an orthogonal approach. It's saying, look, we will take the AI that we have and we will deploy it or diffuse it as widely as possible. And again, it comes back to this idea of new quality productive forces to transform the economy by making it much more productive in every sector. So you mentioned healthcare, you mentioned education, there's logistics, there's manufacturing. So again, we can think of it as maybe like electricity, that it will be everywhere, affecting every form of human activity.
And all these advances that we're talking about, Andy, what kind of opportunities does it create for greater cooperation with the developing world, sometimes the world that we call the Global South?
Absolutely. Well, I think here again, we see a very powerful bifurcation in how China is approaching technology to advance the good of mankind versus that taken by most companies in the United States, or the American approach, in that the U.S. approach is proprietary models, extract as much economic rent as possible, whereas China has taken a completely different approach. It's not necessarily let's get the best, let's get the fastest and the cheapest. So we see this through the deployment of many, many open source models, which makes it much, much cheaper to adopt. And of course, we know in the Global South, enormous human talent, but largely untapped talent, because they've been constrained by economics and by access. So I think here, I think China really, and it's even clear, even though it's early days, that China really is a game changer for the Global South when it comes to technology and the ability to use technology to actually improve human lives.
Andy Mock, thanks for joining us. Well, that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.